Good morning and welcome back. This is 10 Years Hence. Our speaker this morning is Michael O'Sullivan. He is Senior Vice President of Development at NextEra Energy Resources, the nation's leader in producing electricity from clean and renewable fuels, and is also the world leader in producing electricity from sun and wind. Mr. O'Sullivan received his Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from the University of Notre Dame and earned an MBA from the University of Chicago. NextEra Energy Resources, LLC, together with its affiliated entities, is a clean energy leader and is one of the largest wholesale generators of electric power in the United States, with approximately 20,000 megawatts of generating capacity outside of Florida in 25 states and 4 Canadian provinces. Today, NextEra, with its affiliated entities, has over 16,000 megawatts of owned capacity in the U.S. and Canada in their wind and solar fleet. The business also operates clean, emissions-free nuclear power generation facilities in New Hampshire, Iowa, and Wisconsin as part of the NextEra Energy nuclear fleet, which is one of the largest in the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome back to the Notre Dame campus, Mike O'Sullivan.
Thank you. Great to be back. I've got a few goals today. One, to try not to be an infomercial for our company, but I got a few slides in the beginning that explains the company. Also, to try to get to Q&A quickly. That's usually a little more fun, both to pop some people's balloons in here or stump the speaker, which I'm sure this class has done over the years. And then the other thing is my personal challenge is if I can get you to only look at your smartphone once or twice when I fly home to Florida tonight out of O'Hare, I'll consider that a moral victory. So that's kind of what I'm going to try to go through. Before I get really started, anybody from South Florida or Florida? Okay, so we got a couple people. So we might have a couple customers or their families or customers. But that's important only in the sense that half the company serves the electricity of Florida, but I'll get into that in a minute. This is just so you don't front trade and trade in our stock and do something goofy based off of what I'm going to say today. A little background on the company and where I come from. It was a very nice, generous introduction, but we're basically two companies. We are a large utility in South Florida that serves about 50 to 55% of the residents of Florida and about 60% of the electricity that goes through the meter in various parts of Florida. And then we're the large renewable entity with a decent-sized nuclear fleet spread around the U.S. and Canada, and we're exclusively focused only on North America. You're not going to see us chasing business in China or the Middle East or Kazakhstan, places like that. So one of the things that we've been very proud of a few years ago, about 7 years ago, we got named on the cover of Fortune magazine as one of the top 10 most innovative companies in the world. We quickly called up Fortune. I remember talking with our chairman, and we called up Fortune magazine and asked them to redo the math. How could a bunch of guys like us that are a bunch of Dougs, Doug is an acronym for dumb old utility guys, could get named on a cover of a prestigious publication that included Nike, Amazon, Apple, folks like that. So they went and double-checked the math. They said, no, you somehow made it into the top 10. This year, a month ago, they told us we made it again. We again called them and said, go check the math. They said, no, you made it. So here we are, 10 of the last 11 years, we're most admired in our sector. It's a big, important thing for us. And besides stock performance and customer satisfaction, those are the kind of things that we truly get a kick out of. Since this is the business school, I put this slide in that's a little different. 15 years ago, 16 years ago, we were the 30th largest market cap in the sector globally. Now we're number 1, which makes us a target in some respects, but a lot of that's through growth. A decent amount of it is multiple expansion. We can get into that if somebody's interested. But like I mentioned, if you're from Florida or you got family from Florida or somebody's buying electricity in Florida, chances are pretty good that you buy some of our electrons. This is the utility. It's one of the larger utilities in the country. Traditional vertically integrated, about 25 gigawatts or 25,000 megawatts of capacity. And then dirty introduction, a little bit of our renewable fleet, which is by the end of this year will be in 30 states and 4 provinces of Canada. So we're creeping across and getting that map colored in a little bit every year. So let me start out a little bit with wind and give you a perspective of wind and try to go back 10 years. And then at the end, I'm going to try to go forward 10 years with where I see some things in wind and solar. and a little bit in storage. And I've got a couple of videos and a couple of things at the end that are just kind of my guesses on where things are going. On the wind side, it's a big business. This is no longer a niche business. It is a mature business that's had about $1 trillion of capital invested globally, almost all of that in the last 10 years. So when people look at mature businesses like oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, things like that, what has snuck up on them in the last 5, 10, or 12 years is the renewable business. And a lot of it came from heavily subsidized feed-in tariffs, especially in Western Europe. But now, as you'll see, the theme of what I talk about this morning is we're at a point now where the tax subsidies, the feed-in tariffs, things that go on in different jurisdictions are largely going to start rolling off. And probably that's a good thing from a long-term sustainability point, economic sustainability. But in the US, we're about 15 or 20% of the global wind capacity. China has quite a bit, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the US has about 7% of its electricity now on a run rate going forward coming from wind. Kind of like the AP top 25, here's the top 9 countries around the world and where wind is installed from a capacity point of view. Big takeaway from the Chinese is they're installing a lot of, about a third of their wind farms aren't connected to their wholesale grid. And then their wind resource isn't as strong as it is here in North America. Their average capacity factor is 22%. Our average capacity factor is somewhere between 35 and 40. And just about all the wind farms that many of us are building the last 3 or 4 years and the next 3 or 4 years are in the 50, 55% capacity factor. But we can get into that a little bit here. Also in the US, you can see where the jobs are, the manufacturing facilities, a little theme of maybe politics in the country the last 6, 12 months. It's quite a diverse group of folks that are the supply chain. I think a typical wind turbine today has over 600 different components coming from different vendors across the globe. I once asked one of our major vendors, what's the number that come from? So it gives you an idea of the breadth of the economic impact. This is really just the impact in the United States to give you a feel of where things are coming from. And the extension is a big multiplier. I think as of this year, the wind industry spends about $250 to $275 million each and every year paying landowners lease payments for the wind turbines alone. So, and I think the property tax bill is somewhere north of $200 million on top of that. So depending on where you're from, usually a Notre Dame group is a pretty diverse group, whether it's alumni or students. Generally, we're from almost the whole country, every corner of the country, and then there's some parts of the globe. It's a pretty good idea where the wind farms are in this country. To give you a feel for how smart we are and how we don't really pass the IQ test down at NextEra, we put our headquarters down here, and it's a 1,000-mile flight before we get closer to anything we own. So if you think we know what we're doing, maybe you want to discount that a little bit. We don't quite make it easy on ourselves to get to where we've installed most of the things that are currently creating quite a bit of EBITDA and earnings for our company. This is a percentage penetration map of wind. 5, 10 years ago, we didn't even keep maps like this 10 years ago because it was less than 1% of the country's electricity. But you'll see some of the logic intuition that makes sense to you on where some of the power is getting used. Iowa is over 30%. Iowa and Minnesota have been leaders from a percent penetration for probably 5 or 7 years now. And counterintuitively, to those of you who might follow the sector or just touch it occasionally with mainstream media or business periodicals, there's this perception that everything happens in California. And when you see that percentage there, you kind of realize, well, California's a big place, so 6% is a lot of a big place. Let me touch a little bit also on some of the key issues or things we're seeing in wind. And I think the most important part is we're finally in this 7th, 8th, or 9th inning of where tax subsidies are. And we have this phase out in Congress that got passed a little over a year ago, and some guidance that came out of the IRS in May of last year that pretty much sets us up for this 4-year full PTC in wind, and then a 3-year phase out where it goes 80, 60, 40. And the economics are such, and the manufacturing improvements and some of the R&D that's still going into these turbines and blades, and I'll touch on that in a moment, is at a sense now where we're pretty economic already with the subsidy, and I would argue maybe slightly below what customers would still buy at. Even if you raise the price just a little bit. So the subsidy going down is probably a good thing, and now it's teed up regardless of who's in the House or the Senate or the White House. Another key thing I think that's very important is the bottom bullet on this slide. I could draw your eye to that. The biggest new development for wind that most people don't think about is solar is now cheaper in 20 to 25 states. And 2 or 3 years ago, that was true only in 1 or 2 states. So believe it or not, wind has gotten really inexpensive and makes a lot of sense on the wholesale grid, The amazing thing is solar in the last 2 or 3 years has just rocketed right past them in 20 or 25 states, and I'll get into why that's happening. And a little of that's economics, and a little of that is why our headquarters is 1,000 miles from the nearest wind farm. The wind doesn't really blow much in 10 or 15 of those 20 states, so we'll get into that in a second. So who are some of the big customers? These are the companies across the US, mostly utilities, that buy quite a bit at the wholesale level. And wind is kind of a wholesale game. There's a few people with them in their backyards. And the solar game is a little bit more in the backyard in a sense, especially the West Coast, Arizona, and Nevada. But much of the wind that's purchased in this country, I would say 98 or 99%, is by utilities and a little bit of the C&I guys that have come into the space in the last year or two. But these are the guys that buy quite a bit of it. The Excel folks, we alone sell 2,200 at 5,800 megawatts to them. And then from a who owns what we call a Bragawatts chart, this is the folks who own the most wind in North America. Globally, there's a company, 2 companies in China that own a little more than us, but as I mentioned earlier, their efficiency is about half of ours due to grid issues and also just wind resource issues in parts of China where they've deployed a lot of their turbines, and there's a whole different economic driver of what's going on in China that's probably its own course by itself. Many of you probably wonder why wind is concentrated in certain spots. I didn't even draw a circle around the southeast because it's so expensive if we were to put it there. But this gives you an idea, kind of like the price of orange juice, which I'll get into in a minute. Where is it cheaper? The commodity is cheaper for obvious reasons. One is center part of country based on the colors on the map is where it's windier. The other part is generally cheaper, less complex terrain, or what we call simple terrain. Flatter, easier places to build projects where you're not building roads that are winding and twisting off the side of mountains. And then also from an interconnection and land point of view and just density of people and other things, there's quite a bit less of it in the center part of the country. So that meshes up very well with the intensity of the wind, and that's roughly the wholesale price inside those boxes. In groups like this, over the years, I've always gotten an interesting debate about offshore wind. And offshore wind is something I'll mention a little later, but it's a little like satellite phones. It's a unique application that's very expensive that most people really shouldn't dabble in. And I'll summarize it this way. The only reason offshore wind is making progress in the US, or being even talked about, I wouldn't even say it's making progress, is there's a sense of, well, we need the jobs in our neighborhood. Or if you're governor of state X or governor of state Y, you're promoting offshore wind because we want that in our backyard. And to me, that's just not the right way to run the railroad. And what I mean by that is public policy and where we resource things. For example, many of you buy automobiles every 3, 5, or 7 years. And you live in Indiana, or you live nearby here, or you're from another state. Do you mandate that the car is manufactured in the state you live in? And if you had orange juice this morning at breakfast, did you care whether the orange grove and the actual orange was grown in Indiana? And my bottom bullet makes that point. What do you think the glass of orange juice costs to folks from North Dakota and South Dakota if we mandated orange juice had to come from North Dakotan oranges? $200, $300, $400 a glass? You think they'd drink orange juice in North Dakota? I don't think so. So part of the thing about offshore wind is it's a 20 or 30 cent per kilowatt hour wholesale product. And we can make and build this stuff for 2 or 3 cents in the Midwest. Why as a society would we ever make that decision? We don't force automobiles or orange juice guys or anybody else to grow their product or build their product in our backyard. So to give you a little sense of the scale of wind and where it could go ultimately. Anybody here from North Dakota? Okay, good. I can make a little fun of my friends in North Dakota here. There's 650,000 hardy souls that live in North Dakota. It's a great state. I go up there 2 or 3 times a year. We have, I think, 60% market share of wind in North Dakota. It's a wonderful place. Great group of people. But if you wanted to supply all the electricity in the United States, all you have to do is plant wind turbines in North Dakota, roughly evenly spaced across the whole state at the manufacturer's spacing of a wind turbine, which is so many X rotor diameters apart from each other, so you don't wake each other terribly much. And we could supply 100% electricity in this country just from that. So we have the inconvenience, 650,000 out of 310 million of us. Some of them might want to stay, but my point being is land's not the issue, right? The other problem, minor problem for the engineers in this room, they'll jump to that quickly, as much as that's very difficult for me over the years to understand how we went from dial-up to Wi-Fi. And for those of you who travel a lot, get on a plane, American, United, Delta, whoever it may be, you get up to 38,000 feet, you turn on your GoGo account, you interconnect, and you're in this tube going 600 miles an hour at 38,000 feet, and you've got internet connectivity. So for me, as an engineer, it's hard for me to give my biases up because I have this confirmation bias or recency bias or whatever it is, commercially or engineer. But one of the things that's hard for me to understand is maybe someday we'll figure out how to beam electricity around without wires and cables. And I'll get to that in the second half of the discussion as far as more 10 years hence or 10 years forward. So why did wind get so cheap? Well, two or three things happened. It was pretty cheap 15 years ago. When I first took this job in 2001, we were selling wind for 2 or 3 cents to most of the Midwest like we're doing today or the last 3 or 4 years. What happened in the 07, 06, 08 timeframe is oil, commodities, steel, everything got really expensive, and turbine manufacturers weren't making as many turbines and they weren't putting as much into the R&D because it was every other year PTCs, and the feed-in tariffs in Western Europe were kind of on again, off again, and nobody really had certainty. There was certainty of public policy from the late 08, early 09 through 2012, and then the commodity crash happened and a lot of things started coming down in price, and all of that converged on technology. The blades got longer, the net capacity factors went up, and from an automobile analogy that almost everyone in this room can identify with, for the same price or roughly the same price or a lower price, you were going from a 20 mile per gallon car to a 40 mile per gallon car. Who wouldn't want that, right? So pricing came down a lot on the right side, even though our returns pretty much stayed the same. So what does a typical wind project look like? This is a business school, business class. What are the dollars and cents that are thrown around this? Well, a typical project's about 200 megawatts. To most of you, you probably think, oh, Mike, you threw up a lot of these gigawatt, megawatt numbers. Very few people swim in that pool. To give you a context, the United States is about 1 million megawatts or 1,000 gigawatts of power to keep the lights on and everything running in the United States. The state of Florida is a 50 or 60 gigawatt state, so 50 or 60,000 megawatts, to give you a context. So a 200 megawatt wind farm is a sizable investment. It's a big business decision. It's $300 million. It runs today at about a 50% capacity factor. That doesn't mean it's off 50% of the time. It means it's actually producing electricity 80 or 90% of the hours in the year. There are very few hours, if you pick the right spot for a wind farm, where it's never windy. Hot summer days when the high pressure system's sitting over and it's 95 degrees, generally not a good day for us. We see days where our national fleet is single-digit percentage, 5, 6, 7% across everything across the whole country when giant heat waves hit most of them, especially the Midwest and Texas. A screamer day in the winter might be a 60 or 62% capacity factor day or something in the 60s. So the skew to the high side is much lower than the skew to the low side. Also, a project kind of gets about $25 a megawatt hour, typical contract flat for 30 years. So we're committing to sell a commodity forward for 25 years at a known price. There's no way to go in and change that price and raise it. So we kind of better know what we're doing. There's only 2 things you can screw up in a wind farm when you make the business decision. 2 big things that you can't change. One is, if you pick the wrong spot from a Mother Nature point of view, you can't fix that. Nobody in this room is that good. The second one is generally transmission and interconnection, kind of the equivalent of on-ramps and off-ramps on an interstate highway, and then whether you have a commute to work on a segment of the interstate highway that you can't control, and it's always bumper to bumper, and that's the only way for you to get from home to your job. Those are the 2 equivalent things in the electric industry that you cannot fix easily without a lot of money, and generally the money isn't enough to offset the economic harm you've already done to yourself. But that's kind of what drives things there. So let me switch quickly to solar in the interest of still getting to Q&A and having a little fun with that. On the solar side, 5 or 7 years ago, pretty much a niche business, globally and in the US, supported almost entirely by excessively high price feed-in tariffs in Western Europe. Most of us in this country are now seeing solar come up at a wholesale level or even a retail basis out in California, where a lot of people put it on their roof. A price, and I'll just put it in this perspective. I asked this in a class last night, I'll ask it here today. How many folks in this room today know the unit price for the, and you can't answer this question, we had this last night. How many people know the unit price for electricity they pay here in Indiana? Want to guess what it is?
8 cents.
I think it's 10 or 11 from what I learned last night, but it might be 8. My point is, there's what? X number of people here, and there's got to be less than 2% of you that raised your hands. How many people know what the unit price for gasoline is? Key problem our industry, it's why we deserve the term Doug every now and then. Our customers don't even know what they're paying us. So in solar, the Europeans, if the average price for electricity in this country is 12 cents residentially, 12 cents. So here in Indiana, you're a little below that. A lot of folks pay 7, 8, 9 cents. Very few people pay less than that. A lot of people on the West Coast, New York, New England pay 15, 18, and 20 cents. And our friends in Germany, Spain, and elsewhere pay north of 30 cents a kilowatt hour when you do all the currency conversion. So when they decided public policy 10 years ago to put feed-in tariffs that were 30, 40, 50 cents a kilowatt hour to incent solar to get built, they made a public policy commitment and decision to do that in a place like Germany, which was kind of the leader as far as technology, manufacturing, and deployment of wind and solar back 10 years ago. On their bill, every German gets surcharged 7 cents a kilowatt hour every month on top of that 30 cents to pay for all the wind. You'd expect that of the Germans. They made a public policy decision, they knew they were paying extra, and they made a disciplined financial decision to pay that off or to pay for that subsidy. How many of you in this country think folks like us that run the big utilities in this country would not get shot, and I mean that figuratively, not literally, at our state capitals when we went in for a rate case to adjust electric rates if we said, you know, let's just be 20 or 30% renewables, and we'll add 7 cents a kilowatt hour to that 12-cent average rate. Not going to happen. Same reason people throw up their arms around here when gasoline went from $1.50 to $4.50. Today, we kind of generally don't complain at $2.20 or $2.15 or $2.29, right? Everybody kind of figures as long as it doesn't go back to that $4 stuff, I'll keep my mouth shut. And there's this little secret little handshake we all make with each other, right? On the electric side, renewables, somebody had to pay for it. I would argue the Germans and the Spaniards paid dearly for it. They're going to pay for it. We all should send them a thank you card every Christmas. So where are we going today in the US? Today in the US, there's about 100 gigawatts of this stuff in Europe. There's about 30 gigawatts AC of it in the US. If you remember, I said there's about 1,000 gigawatts in the United States of electric capacity. There's about just under 500 gigawatts of wind installed globally. That's an AC number. That's actually how you get paid and how it goes through the meter. We won't get into the DC AC thing, but the DC thing is just a slightly inflated number because extra panels get installed for the conversion, the line losses, and just the way we get paid and how it works in the solar facility to capture the energy. So it's a little bit like a fish story. It's a 12-inch fish, right? So in the US, there's about 30 gigawatts of this stuff. AC, a good chunk of it has gotten installed just in the last year or two. And that has to do with largely economics and then also a perception we had that the tax credit was going away at the end of 2016 and it magically got renewed in late 15, but it was too late to change the momentum of what was happening. So we cannibalized a lot of decisions in this country in wind and solar back in 2013 and 14 into the 2016 year, thinking that the cliff was going to happen in 2017. And in reality, we got a new life for 7 years with the extended credits and the phase-outs. Another thing to take away is thermal projects. Everybody can understand what a PV panel looks like. Everyone's probably seen one either on the side of a road or on a rooftop or maybe an industrial facility, a large utility scale facility. There was this thing called solar thermal. We own about 600 or 700 megawatts of solar thermal out of that 2,000 megawatts that are built in the US. Those are largely dinosaurs now. They'll run until their natural life or economic lives end. But largely an expensive product that's kind of a 15-cent, $150 product that just the O&M alone, just the labor and materials and consumables to run those plants today, $40 to $50 a megawatt hour, and we can build PV for 30, 40, or 50, which includes capital, O&M, property taxes, everything. So PV has just displaced it through innovation and low price and is probably here to stay and the commodity of choice or the technology of choice going forward. So when you look at where all the solar in this country is, there's quite a bit of it in California. A lot of that was paid for dearly at prior prices, not quite so bad as the Germans and the Spaniards. A couple of those states look kind of odd to you and go, holy cow, I'm from New Jersey or Massachusetts, I can't believe there's that much solar. That has nothing to do with the sun shining a lot. It has all to do with a lot of special subsidies that were at the state level, and then also a phenomenon that happens a little more now because solar's gotten cheaper, and that is very high electric rates undercut by people installing solar and jumping away from the utility as much as possible for ordinary electric service. So that's the phenomenon. In Arizona and Nevada, that makes kind of intuitive sense to probably everybody in the room. North Carolina is also a giant tax incentive that has largely gone away, and that created a lot of new entrants coming into the space. So who owns all this solar facilities? Our organization owns quite a bit of it. A couple of the other folks on here. Unlike wind, if you listed the top 25 folks in the wind industry in the United States, 18 of them you wouldn't recognize their names, and you have to Google them and find out they're just small, privately held companies, perhaps not from a publicly traded or investor-oriented point of view or ownership. In the solar space, a little different. It's morphed this way probably because of the way the tax credit's handled and how attractive it is and how quick it needs to get utilized for the financials to work from a tax-efficient return. So what's happened in the last just 2 years, everything's moving east. Solar has dropped in price exponentially, dramatically, to the point where in 20 or 25 of those states, solar will beat wind either due to economics or permittability. For example, in New England, solar is more expensive than wind, but at least it's close enough in price, but you can find land where people won't show up and fight you, especially in the Northeast. New York, upper part of the Atlantic coast, and New England, solar is probably in the $60 to $80 range, and wind is probably in the same price range, maybe a little cheaper, but almost impossible to permit due to congestion, land, costs, and the wind doesn't blow much in the Northeast. So the price of coming down has kind of competitively busted out the wind market, and that's how I see things going, and we're already seeing the early skirmishes of that. But in the wholesale market, remember, residential electricity is 12 cents average. Some parts a lot higher, some parts lower. In the big scheme of things, utilities spend about half of that residential rate for transmission, distribution, and other costs, and then roughly half of that is the generation cost. And this is the energy-only piece of generation. Solar and wind are kind of an intermittent form of energy only. It's not necessarily firm capacity like a nuclear or coal plant, so we're talking a little bit apples and oranges when we mix the two together. But from the sake of today's discussion, this gives you a good sense of how inexpensive it's gotten. 4 years ago, that bottom circle was 10 cents to 20 cents, and you wouldn't even circle anything up in the upper Midwest and the Northeast. It was north of $150 or $200 a megawatt hour, so nobody would have been doing that. So what are some of the key trends in the solar business? We have quite a lot going on globally. As I'll talk in a few moments, I think globally, solar eventually passes wind very soon. But the cheapness is getting people to make economic decisions, and I think things like what happened this week with the filing of bankruptcy in South Carolina and Georgia with a few nuclear plants that are kind of half built or partially built. I don't know if it's exactly half. You're going to see some people running some new spreadsheets and making some decisions that have new facts in them that 2, 4, and 6 years ago were not the same. So it'll be interesting what those changes. So we see a lot more folks interested in utility scale solar, especially if it's in the $30 to $50 price. And if wind is in the $15 to $25 price, you might ask, well, why is wind not still kicking its tail? You got to understand solar is also peak coincident. Maybe not a day like today with drizzle and cloud cover, but you generally know when your sunny days are coming and you can plan around that, and there's a higher value to electricity during the day when it's peak coincident, when folks are awake and people are running the AC or running the laptops or whatever it may be. So remember I had that picture of North Dakota a little earlier about how much land we'd need to just take over the world and run all the wind if we could beam it around wirelessly. So I had the guys calculate the same size of land we would need in Nevada or out near Nevada, and that little orange box is all you need to hit the peak coincident peak in the United States on a hot summer day with solar. It's not a land issue. Plus, if you want to use this land, for those of you who follow what the federal government owns, I think the federal government owns half or 60% of Nevada, so we should be able to figure that out if we wanted to do that. I'm not saying we should, but just to give you a concept that it's not a land issue. Sometimes you can read some media articles, mainstream media or other articles that might make you seem that we're eating up all the farmland in this country for solar or wind. So why did solar get cheap? Well, two things happened. Innovation and competitive pressures collided while incentives were still in place and everybody met at the town hall or the center in the intersection or the traffic circle, and everybody went around a couple times and out popped a very inexpensive product that solves a lot of problems for a lot of folks, both politically and economically. So what happens here is the panels got cheaper. I was mentioning last night that 49-cent number is even less than that today in the marketplace for spot purchases. So panels and installed products in 2012 were around $4 a watt. Today we're installing these things for right around $1. How did that happen? Efficiencies of panel, manufacturing techniques, all improved, but balance of plant was where the most money came out. The material, men and women and labor that went in, the way we fabricate these things, the way we deliver them to the sites, the way the industry deploys them out in their rows, all got smarter the last 2, 3, or 4 years. Some of that was fear of the tax credit dropping off like we all thought it was going to happen. Some of it was just natural innovation that happens globally. So now we have a product that's a $30 to $50 product that just a few years ago was north of $100 and still got demand in places like California and Arizona where they had public policy and or higher rates, but largely everybody else in the country says, just come back and sell me some wind if it makes sense. Now we got 2 products we're selling to folks, and it's quite an interesting dynamic. So what are some of the project economics of a solar project? This is at scale, not on a rooftop, which is a different discussion. Typical project might be 120 megawatts, might be about $150 million in upfront capital. Tax credit's about 30% of that, roughly $40 million. It doesn't apply on the total construction cost because you can't take a tax credit on land purchases and some other things that don't count. But it's almost the whole purchase price. A typical capacity factor, remember I was telling you earlier, a windy spot in North Dakota might be 50. A solar spot in the Sun Belt might be in the high 20s, mid-20s. Georgia's about 26. You get up to this part of the country, it's 18, 19, 21%-ish. But you got to think about it as almost doubling it because we're selling it only during the day. So a wind project's 50, but half the time it's dark or the weekend, and the utility might not want it because the load is low. So when you start doing that time of day adjustment, solar has a little different value. So a 20 to 25 NCF or capacity factor or efficiency, get 32, 34, 35% in some of the arid desert areas of the country. You start making some powerful leaps in the economic queue of who wants to buy electricity and what they want it from. So a very important milestone for us to get to that price. I think it's also interesting that the O&M cost is right about the same price as wind, as far as staffing, labor, maintenance, property taxes, insurance, things of that nature. So a couple key takeaways I would offer for folks to consider around solar business and where it's going or where it's just recently been is, it's here to stay. It's a little bit easier for politicians to get their arms around it. It's a little bit like hugging babies and kissing kittens or something like that. Maybe I got it backwards. Kissing babies and hugging kittens, right? There is an elected official in this country, left of center or right of center, that doesn't want to see a solar project in their backyard. Wind's a different issue. 75 to 78% of the wind farms in this country are in congressional districts, and you're going to be shocked by this, that are Republican. Our support for wind is very bipartisan. Just publicly, when you watch the news or you read the media, you're going to see mostly it viewed as a Democratic issue, but the property taxes jobs are in Republican districts. You may ask, why then is public media or public perception anti-wind? It's very simple. Our prior president and occupant in the White House was very publicly supportive of renewables. He wasn't afraid to talk about it. As a result, the opposition party would always say bad things about anything he was for. It was that simple publicly. Privately, they would always say, we're on your side. Same thing we see now. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. We can talk a little bit more of that. The economics, the horse is out of the barn. It doesn't matter. So let me spend a couple minutes on storage, and then I've got an interesting video and 2 or 3 slides I'm going to play for you to make a point about innovation, disruption, and how you can't sit on your laurels as a big company, even though you're the big market cap or you're the guys who make the most money at something. And you're going to see a little talk I'm going to have in a minute that's about a 2-minute video of Steve Ballmer, who ran Microsoft for 10 or 15 years after Mr. Gates ran it and founded it. I think he was one of the first employees with Mr. Gates. It's a pretty interesting talk. Before I get to that, to make my point around storage, let me give you a little thing. First of all, storage in the energy industry is going to be a tertiary beneficiary of automotive and electronic devices. When you see the capacity of what the LG Chems, Samsungs, and Panasonics are making around batteries, and the market they're chasing for automotive and the electronic devices, it dwarfs what our industry might need. So we're kind of like the Germans and Spaniards gave us the free ride in the US on solar panels and solar technology, and we got the benefit largely of that reduction in costs, and they paid dearly for it. The automotive and electronic industries are such a giant consumer of this product that we're going to benefit as the price comes down. And already today, I'm going to press the wrong one. Already today, we're buying batteries at this price over here. So this is from a third-party estimate, but the stuff we're buying in the market is already $100, $200 a kilowatt hour lower than we all thought 2 or 3 years ago. So like solar, like anything else we buy in society, if the price comes down, what happens? It creates more demand, and the unintended consequence of that abroad, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. Unless you interned, worked, or a Doug, like me, you have no idea what all this stuff means on this slide. So why did I put it on here? It's really to tell you there's a lot of Swahili and Klingon that goes every day to keep the lights on and keep the grid moving. This is all the crap that happens every day by the utilities around this country. Storage and cheap storage or cheaper batteries or systems that comprise of batteries help do a lot of these things smarter, better, and easier going forward. And as I got a slide in a minute that talks about the iPhone, almost, as I look out here, 2/3 of you probably showed up in high school and had a smartphone when you were in 9th grade. About 1/3 of you are my vintage or a little older and are still figuring out the device on how this thing changes your life. But we're going to talk about that in a minute. It's a big analogy I make. And why I think storage is so disruptive in a good way and innovative, and cost reduction could change how we look at things, and I'll make the tie to smartphones. These are all the Klingon and Swahili things that happen. Largely, this stuff is what the storage industry and the electric sector was deploying the last couple of years. We've kind of saturated the US Northeast with this stuff now, and it's a cheaper, more efficient way to provide the electric grid its frequency regulation. The problem is, if we did this the whole country for all the frequency regulations needed on the whole grid in the United States, it's about 2 or 3 gigawatts of batteries, which is not a lot. You know, I'm exaggerating, but it's probably 10 minutes of manufacturing at the battery factories over in Asia. This is the Holy Grail. T&D asset deferral, shifting arbitrage, taking renewables at midnight, using it in noon, things of that nature. But this is all the inside baseball stuff that we worry about, and why I am very bullish or optimistic this part of technology is going to change how the grid works. And I don't mean you will notice that. The switch will still work the same way. The plug will still work the same way. I just think a lot of that's going to change. If I get a little help with this video. While she's queuing that up, there's a great quote that Tim Cook had, runs Apple now. And I think it summarizes the iPhone very well, or the smartphone. We make products people didn't know they wanted, and now they can't live without. I joked yesterday in a class, probably true of almost every undergrad or graduate student here. If you accidentally leave your phone back in the dorm or at your off-campus house once, do you go to the ER for help, or do you go back and get it, right? You go through heart palpitations, you have cold sweats, you think you're going to die if you can't have that device in your hand or your pocket the rest of the day, right?
The Zune was getting some traction, then Steve Jobs goes to Macworld and he pulls out this iPhone. What was your first reaction when you saw that?
$500 fully subsidized with a plan? I said, that is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine. Now, it may sell very well or not. We have our strategy. We've got great Windows mobile devices in the market today. You can get a Motorola Q phone now for $99. It's a very capable machine. It'll do music. It'll do internet. It'll do email. It'll do instant messaging. So I kind of look at that and I say, well, I like our strategy. I like it a lot.
Now, with hindsight, are there things I'd do differently? Of course.
Like what?
Come on, Charlie. I probably would have started us doing hardware earlier so that we could have been more effective in the phone business.
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of like an IQ test. Should Microsoft have a position in the phone business?
Yes.
the two most profitable companies. We were the #1 most profitable company in our business for a long time.
Right.
Two guys have passed us, and they both did it by making phones, Apple and Samsung. So, I mean, I don't think software was the right play there, but the two most profitable companies now in our business are Apple, Samsung, Microsoft.
Right.
For years, it was Microsoft and some other guys.
Yeah.
So, do I wish we had done that sooner? Of course I do.
Then why didn't you?
When the name of your company is Microsoft and your formula works, our formula was working. We were software guys. Bill Gates told Paul Allen when Paul first wanted to do hardware back in the 70s, we are software guys. So for us, it was kind of a religious transformation.
How is this guy from Florida going to connect iPhones and Steve Ballmer to what I'm talking about today? They sat on their laurels. They were wealthy. They were one of the largest market caps in their sector. And they weren't paranoid or worried enough about innovation, disruption to their business model. What we do a little different at our company, why I largely believe we've climbed the market cap rankings to a leadership position globally, is we get up every day absolutely paranoid of what can go wrong. I don't mean safety of our nuclear plants. That's happened for decades. Who is going to come in and disrupt our industry and change it? Renewables is a big disruptor. Will it get to 50 or 100% of the grid? I don't think so. In places it will. But right now we're at a 7 or 8% in the US. It probably tops out at 20-some% when you guys are my age. But let me get to a point around storage to make my point around the iPhone and other things. Today, or recently, these are the two little ways we have deployed storage. There's about 0.5 gigawatts today deployed. It'll be a little higher at the end of this year or last year. But this is really the only two things. For all of you that are old enough to remember getting your first smartphone, especially in 07 and 08, you got it, you went boop, and you called mom. Or mom called you and you went boop, and you saw her picture, and you said, "Hi, Mom." And that was enough. It wasn't the sole reason you bought one, because you wanted to be trendy, you wanted to understand what was going on. But you had no idea in 2017 the 8 or 10 reasons you have a smartphone besides keeping your health and not having panic attacks on your way to class is texting, email. If you're a little older in this room, your life's documents are on there. Access to the internet, traffic information, the website to check in when you fly Delta, American, United. Your whole stinking life is on that thing. And the 8th or 9th reason you have a smartphone today, one of the smallest uses of an iPhone, is boop, "Hi, Mom." There is no way any of us in this room knew that was happening. Back to the top of that page, those folks at Apple figured out something that we all didn't know we needed. And then there's another guy I really admire, the guy at the bottom. How many folks know who Wayne Gretzky is? Okay. How many folks know what GOAT means? God, I had a bet with everybody who works for me that I'd get only 2 or 3 hands up. So when I look at what's disruptive and what we worry about in our industry, that I worry about is how do we get over here? Remember that Klingon and Swahili slide I had up a few minutes ago? The iPhone or the smartphone, battery storage, that's the thing we have to think about hard and get out in front of it, just like some folks got out in front of renewables. Renewables largely was a public policy thing. But now it's an economic thing that take away your politics on emissions, take away your politics on clean air, take away a Clean Power Act, a Clean Power Plan, take away your politics on Paris. If it's the same price, why wouldn't we deploy it to the best way to run the railroad? Not in the water, not on every street corner where it's going to cost orange juice for $200 a glass. That's not my point. My point is it's an economic choice that we haven't had in decades. We should take advantage of it. So couple statistics on US storage. It's 500 megawatts. Remember the numbers I was telling you, that's this much, right? It's not a lot. It's happening. In 2007, the only people that stood in line at the Apple store to buy an iPhone were young people who were unemployed. Okay? It took off. Your generation, many of you in this room, don't know how to fathom without one. I have a smartphone device. I shouldn't admit to this on video, I still carry a flip phone too. You don't believe me? It's over on the counter. I took it off so the microphone wouldn't get screwed off. You ask, why does a guy like him carry a flip phone? We can get into that afterwards during Q&A if you're interested. So what's next? A little inside baseball stuff here. We have Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the FERC. They're kind of like the FAA or FDA of our industry. They're a very important group. Most people don't even know who the commissioners are. Very important regulatory body. They've been pushing this storage thing with rules on the grid for about 3 or 4 years. One of the most honored things I had was a year and a half ago. I got invited by the chairman of FERC to meet him in his conference room and explain to him storage and solar. Hour and a half later, I felt like the guy understood it. He was very flattered that I came, but I was honored to have represented the company and explain it to him. And then we saw more and more things come out of FERC to help push this industry, not economically, just public policy, just push some of the rules. Because in the grid, we have a lot of guys like Steve Ballmer, electrical engineers that are paid to keep the lights on every day. I don't want to mess with it and change my business model. It's going to happen. Your generation is going to change that. Our sector, the automotive industry sector, is going to drive this. It's hundreds of billions of dollars of opportunity of investment and product, along with electronic devices everybody has in their pocket or on their laptop in front of them today. This is just the tip of the iceberg for our sector, where the dollars are from storage. And it's a wonderful story. I'll tell one human capital discussion to make my point on how exciting storage is in our company. 15, 16 years ago when I took this assignment, I had to beg people to work in the wind group. Who wanted to work in wind? The sexy stuff was nuclear and gas turbine, combined cycle, and maybe even a coal plant. Why would I want to work on this stuff that's less than 1% of the electricity in this country? And it's this tax credit that expires every year or two. I don't want to go near it. So I kind of took any professional that was willing to give it a try, and I had to twist some arms and coerce some people to stay in the group. Who would have thunk 10, 15 years later, we got $30 billion invested in wind and solar. Then in 08 and 09, I had to create a solar group. And that product was orange juice in North Dakota. It was $200 a megawatt hour. Who the heck would put their career into that? Coming out of college, or 5 years in the company, or 10 years? Why would I bet that? The last 4 years, every time we have an opening we post in the storage group, we get unbelievable volunteers asking us before we even hit the send button to post it on the internal website. The younger generation wants to be part of this. So as an older generation guy, I look at it and go, something's happening here. So I have all these little indicators I throw together, which gives me a little lead to a little thinking forward that I was asked to do. The horse is out of the barn as far as economics and tax credits in wind and solar. They're phasing out. That's a good thing. The economics of wind and solar are such that high likelihood we survive fine without them over the next 4 to 7 years. The transition's going to go well. This stuff's very inexpensive. Customers love it and want to buy more of it for the right reasons. Remember what I said earlier, our biggest customers are buying this in red states. Very counterintuitive. They're buying it for business reasons, not public policy reasons, which is the best reason, perhaps, to have a sustainable business model or a sustainable product to sell. Second thing I think that's very important is we're right about 7% now. A lot of wind in this country is going to get built in the center part of the country going forward because of the coastal part and the southern Sun Belt, the traditional Sun Belt. Solar is cheaper, so you're going to see less wind built. As a result, wind will get to probably 150 gigawatts, maybe a little more, if it stays cheap and gas doesn't get more expensive. Gas gets more expensive, natural gas. I think wind could pick up a lot more market share than the 150. I also believe solar in this country will probably catch wind. Globally, it'll catch it sooner. And the big driver there is, and I'll get to this in a minute, in developing countries or third world countries, the quality of life changes quickly if you have dependable electricity. It doesn't have to be necessarily as cheap. There's just a giant part of the globe that doesn't have access to electricity still. It would amaze you what that number is. So when we look at the global capacity for solar, I believe especially its economics, and I think the best example is going to be the Middle East. You have rational economic thinking by the oil powers, those national states that control quite a bit of what OPEC controls, 50% of the oil in the world or something like that. Those countries are now running their oil business commercially the way you get taught in this business school day in and day out for the first time in probably 50 years. $50 oil fracking has caused them to be competitive and think about things. And you know what that's caused them to do? They burn a sizable amount of their production at the well in their power plants to keep the lights on in their countries. Guess what they're now doing? They're deploying tens of gigawatts of solar the next 3 to 5 years to replace the oil they're burning so they can sell the oil at $50. The opportunity cost got too great now that they're watching their P's and Q's and they're dotting their I's and crossing their T's in their budgets because they don't have the $100 a barrel stuff anymore. They got to make their economy work on 50. So suddenly that marginal barrel has a lot of value. Big driver of that is cheap solar. What might happen on natural gas is a key driver, but natural gas is probably going to stay in the $2, $3, or $4 range for a long time. Now we're seeing innovation move into the large mature wells, and oil and gas is getting pulled out at the marginal cost at a fair rate of return to those investors at a lower and lower commodity price, which is causing good geopolitical reshuffling, I would argue. When you sit here in North America and watch what's going on in Venezuela, the Middle East, and Russia. But I largely believe, and this is just my personal opinion, it's not a company opinion, but when the Saudis 2 years ago decided to not fight the price of oil and keep pumping, I believe that was a military decision, not an economic decision. They worry about things in their backyard more than us Americans worry about. They're worried about the Iranians and the Russians and people like that in their sphere. And what could hurt those people more than tanks or ships? $40 oil. That's my theory, but that's not for today's class. I just detour a little bit there because I put a little natural gas if it's there. And cheap, it's going to keep everybody honest, and that also will keep the pressure on the renewable industry to be innovative, keep designing panels or wind turbines that are better and smarter, more efficient, and then that collision of innovation and disruption will keep the price down, which will keep demand up. My last comment, you probably took this from that slide I had earlier. I just think offshore wind stays and is more of a boutique renewable for special situations. I didn't really elaborate on that slide, but many of you probably read it quicker than I could ever talk to it. I just believe it's too expensive. And now solar is probably the killer app that puts offshore wind out of business, because now you can do solar. If you're making a public policy decision, why make all the trouble to go out in the water and do these things at a very expensive price? So I have 4 or 5 slides here just thinking through how the electric system may look over the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. And one of them is something we're seeing with the younger generation that you see on campus in undergrad and graduate classes, but also just the tech-savvy folks that are even in their 30s. And it's the empowered consumer. People are buying things now just for the same reason people buy smartphones for $700. And you just kind of understand, to call mom, that this doesn't make sense, right? $700, my flip phone costs $15. And from a phone call point of view, it's a bad decision. But this is happening every day. People are turning over their appliances, turning over their products, new innovations coming in the consumer sector, and it's changing how we deploy the meters and how we run the grid and how we supply electricity into the home, which is still 40, 50% of electricity in this country. I have one very interesting stat to tell you about the empowered consumer that's kind of fun about smart meters. You may hear the term smart meter and go, what's a smart meter? Smart meter is the digital device. The electricity comes through your house versus that spinning device that was in there for 50 or 100 years. And you may think, how sophisticated could that be? So let me just tell you one small story of how the big guy in one industry was asleep at the switch, like Mr. Baumer was. We deployed 4.5 to 5 million smart meters over the last few years. The last few got put in 3 years ago, maybe 4 years now. We now have 4.9 million customers in Florida. When we deployed those smart meters, we found 67,000 customers we didn't know we had. We had to create an amnesty program. We had to create an amnesty program because we weren't sure if employees were screwing up, missing and losing those 67,000 customers, or we had 67,000 customers that had figured out over the last decade or two how to get electricity and not get sent a bill. We had a conundrum. What do we do? Do we investigate and go figure out how many people, how many months, how many years, how many decades some of these people were getting free electricity? Or do we go find out whether it was a cabal of employees doing it on purpose and putting money in their pocket? We had no way of figuring it out, right? Technology caused us to figure that out. So we had amnesty. Our chairman called it amnesty. But we had 67,000 people show up, and suddenly we're back on the, and you know why we figured that out? We pinged everybody back on the meters, and we matched it up with the billing records, and we said, oh my gosh, we got 67,000 people we didn't know we had. If that could happen to us, extrapolate that across the grid. Only 20 of you in this room will understand what I'm about to talk about, and many of you are going to scratch your head just like that a guy could have a flip phone, right? How many of you remember getting milk at home by a milkman, and they'd put it in a bottle, and they'd put it in a little stainless steel box, and you'd close the lid? When I grew up in the Bronx, that's how I got milk. Many of you today, under 30, are going, how can that be safe? How can you protect it? Anybody could walk by your apartment and do whatever they want in the milk bottle, right? That's how society trusted each other 40 and 50 years ago. That's how we got our milk delivered in urban places or in rural places. Cost effective, everything worked, everybody trusted each other. It was quality milk, it wasn't secondhand, it wasn't yesterday's retreads. When I get up and think of how my colleagues and peers that are in charge of keeping the lights on in Florida worry about things, look at that little truck. It's a bad cartoon, but we bastardized it a little bit. But think about it. You have a box about this size that's an air conditioner today outside a home. It runs maybe 5 or 10% of the hours of the year if you live up here. It runs 60 or 70% of the hours of the year, maybe 80 where I live. But it's not inconceivable that a battery could get delivered once a week, brought in, brought out, maybe a little bigger, maybe a little smaller. Depends on whether you're home all 7 days, whether you cycle the AC. Maybe you only need to be replacing it every 30 days or every 14 days, depending on whether the kids are home from college or you run the AC or things like that. You call the guy up like you call the milkman. If this happens because of cheap storage, who does it put out of business? The Microsofts of the utility business. The existing T&D utilities are sitting on their laurels, just being Dougs every day, just assuming I have a monopoly. Your generation, back to the consumer choice earlier side, your generation largely will want more choice, and you will not be afraid of making this transition. My generation will prefer to pay the old-fashioned utility as long as the price is an economic good deal. Your generation will not be afraid to have freedom of choice. Another one, I talked a little bit about Wi-Fiing on an airplane or just Wi-Fi in general. Hard to get my head around it 10, 15 years ago when I had to. But electricity beaming around a house or charging without wires or cables has decent potential maybe at the local level. You got an engineering challenge, you got technology challenge, you got safety challenges that are embedded in that. But again, who would have thunk AOL and dial-up would have went out of business 15 years ago when we all started getting addicted to the internet? We're in a different spot today, right? It's not a hard reach to believe we can wirelessly move electricity around at some capacity or some form, and over the next 10 or 20 years, somebody might figure something out that's very disruptive and changes how we as an industry deliver the product you want more choice and want more flexibility and freedom around. So when I look at that, I kind of think, well, a little out there, but that's something I don't think is out of reach in the next 10 or 15 years. Maybe at a smaller scale, maybe in a neighborhood or in the house. Another thing that I've kind of hit hard the last half of the discussion is the batteries. They're getting cheaper, they're getting deployed everywhere. And whether it's combining them with solar, where we're seeing true economics below 10 cents a kilowatt hour delivered, when you combine them both at the right size and scale, and that's the part we're still experimenting. We're still in the test tube lab trying to figure that out. What's the right blend? But when you try to get that together, cheap new commodity, cheap new innovative disruptive element to the grid, it's also in your devices. You're already familiar with it. It's going to be in your cars. So many of you already have hybrids or things where you have some sort of electric component that's already got that. You're comfortable with that technology. It's not going to be that disruptive to you. On the medical side, I'm told, this is a leap of faith from some of my staff, that there's quite a few advances being done wirelessly. That's going to cause, even in the medical space, things to change drastically on how we transmit or use power or energy or diagnostic equipment to make ourselves healthier and better as a society. So when you look at where things are going electrically, I think there's tons of room for us to be Microsoft. And as a result, we try to stay up every day and figure it out. And I think one of them is electric cars. If you look at the graph on the left, or excuse me, the right, you'll see it's interesting. Most folks think, what would happen if we went all electric cars? It'd be really good for us utility companies. The reality is the consumption increase, the production increase and the consumption by more electric cars is microscopic compared to the grid's consumption today. 5, 10, 20% electricity consumption if everybody went all electric cars. It's not going to change how many power plants we have in this country. If it gets absorbed over 10, 20, 30 years, and the transition goes to 10, 20, 30% of the fleet's all electric from something below 1% today, you can see the impact is going to be gradual, and it's really not going to change the electric grid. But it's a big opportunity because, again, your society, kind of like horses in the Model T, everybody wants more choice, more freedom, and then there's a bigger driver on sustainability and things of that nature. And then there's still the economic part. So that's coming, and we're seeing dramatic changes. And my personal opinion of electric cars is that the BMWs, the Hondas, the GMs, the Toyotas, the Fords, they're going to figure it out because they have the scale. And the early entrants that get a little more press today are just very expensive, high valuations. I don't know if any of the courses that some of you guys take try to look and justify a guy like Tesla at the EBITDA level and the market cap they trade at. But I'm a believer that the guy that figures out the $20,000 and $30,000 car first to make a buck on that is going to be one of those 5 or 7 global guys, because it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, and we've met a few of them and working with some of them on battery technology and used batteries and things that they're doing behind the car investments and R&D they're doing. It's quite exciting. And when you get a tour of a place like BMW's headquarters in Germany and get to see for a day the R&D dollars and scale and scope of what they're investing in batteries, this is not a small bet. This is not a story about Tesla. This is a story about how the automotive industry is going to change. And then my last slide before questions is this one. I talked about this a little earlier, but I think battery storage combined with solar, and this is a very micro example of such, you get a situation where quite a bit of the world is not as lucky as we are to have electricity at the switch and inexpensive. And their quality of life, whether it's sanitation, irrigation, crops, or just having potable water or electricity on a regular basis for a few hours every day, when you start deploying that and you give them a chance to share that with their neighbors or economically deploy it in a way where they don't even have access to it, and the government-run utility in probably 50 or 100 countries in this world is not interested in dispersing it like we did in this country 100 years ago through rural electrification, it's just going to leap over, kind of like landlines were leapt over by smartphones and even flip phones 10 or 20 years ago. So that's a little view of what I think is going to happen in the electric sector because of renewables and storage, and my thoughts on trying to think ahead. But I think it'd be more fun to maybe talk about what you guys think and maybe have a little discussion around energy. Or you can go to lunch early.
So I understand that hot days are good for generating electricity in the Midwest, right?
Hot days?
Yes.
Bad days for the wind farms.
Okay.
Hot days usually mean the wind's not blowing.
Okay. My question is, as we take more energy out of the atmosphere, what's the thinking on how that might impact the environment?
We take more energy out of the atmosphere?
Yes.
You mean sun?
The wind taking energy out of the atmosphere.
I don't know if this is technically correct, but I would guess with a solar panel on the ground or a wind turbine up in the air, at some point the energy's going to dissipate anyways on its own, right? It's either going to go right into the ground or it's going to wisp away as it blows out, a few hundred miles or wherever. I've never thought about it. I frankly don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. I could make a guess that my gut says it can't impact things too much, but I don't know.
Different ways. So unproductive, that dissipates through friction and through heat and produces electricity. It all ends up
So Notre Dame just installed geothermal wells out by the Stevens Center, and you didn't mention geothermal in your presentation at all. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on geothermal and where it might be headed in the next 10 years.
Yeah, there are 5 or 7 other forms of renewable energy that make economic sense, depending on where you are in the world, right? And depending on the scale you want to deploy it, right? Geothermal, landfill gas, kind of renewable. Waste to energy, biomass, right? That kind of hydro. There's 2 or 3 reasons we don't focus on them. One, if you've ever read the book Moneyball, or if you're a baseball fan, you'll get to my first reason why NextEra is not in it. And then I'll get to the second reason, which overlaps why we're in it. If there's 9 in Moneyball, you learn, not the movie, in the book, there's 9 parts to a strike zone, right? And generally, anybody who's a Hall of Fame hitter hits 300, and they're considered Hall of Fame in a career. But if you bat 250, you generally don't make the Hall of Fame unless you hit a lot of home runs, right? 5% better. 5% better. When you plot what people bat in the strike zone, they're generally, whether they bat 250 or 300, there's 2, 3, or 4 of those boxes of 9, they bat 400. Then there's 2, 3, or 4 of those boxes, they bat 200. And then there's 2 or 3 boxes, they're horrible. Whenever they swing at that pitch, they bat 100 or less. Almost all baseball players, whether they're Hall of Fame or not, have the same boxes. I mean, the boxes might move, but the numbers are roughly the same. So you go back, what's the difference in the 5%? And the theory in Moneyball, if I remember correctly, it's been at least 10 years since I read it. If I remember correctly, the answer was that batter is more disciplined to take that pitch and have a called strike. And he will wait one more pitch, hoping he gets one that's the 400 or 300 box. When the 250 hitter generally will swing at it because it's a strike. So why am I using this analogy? Our business is about plenty of strikes. There's plenty of boxes we can hit the ball. We've decided to concentrate on the wind and solar strikes, not the biomass, landfill gas, waste to energy, hydro, all those things, for 2 or 3 reasons. One, what expertise do we have in those? Minimal. 2, even if I have 50% global market share in geothermal, it's about the equivalent CapEx that we do in 1 year in wind. So I got to put an army of people on planes all over the world chasing geothermal projects because they're longer to permit, harder to find, they're not on every street corner, right? There's nothing wrong with geothermal. It's still a strike. You can still make money at it. People still want it. But from our point of view, it's a ground ball to second base. So from my perspective, I'm looking to put guys on base, right? Deploy capital smartly, good ROE, make money for the shareholders, fit in with public policy. All those things are important to a big company. But at the same time, if I get into those things, I got to deploy a lot of human capital to chase a very small market when you look at the context of how big a machine we have to move every day. So that's why. So the university's looking at different things. I've been lucky to be part of some of those things with some committees or groups. It's quite exciting to see the university deploy some different things, interesting. And their constraints are different, right? They have to do it at a certain scale. They have certain land or opportunity. You got the hydro project downtown. You got the geothermal. You got some solar panels. They have other constraints into their strike zone, right? They can't put the large utility scale wind turbines. You got a couple of the smaller ones. But my point is you can't do, because you got constraints living in this region, this neighborhood, zoning, economics, land, whatever it might be.
Thank you.
You had a question?
In what countries are most of your photovoltaic PV cells and wind turbines manufactured? And if it's foreign countries, does that give NextEra a view on tariffs, or do you expect the U.S. to sort of catch up and create jobs in the renewable energy manufacturing era place?
Panels are made in probably a dozen or 2 dozen countries. Some are made here. Some are made in Vietnam, some are made in Malaysia, some are made in China. We're largely agnostic. We're buying a commodity and we don't really care where it comes, but there's tariffs that influence that. And generally the manufacturers have figured out and they've moved their stuff the last few years to countries that aren't targets of tariffs. So it's a pretty sophisticated industry and the cost to mobilize or redeploy that capital equipment isn't that high. So, and the same is true with batteries. The initial cost to build a factory is not as big as you would think. As long as you get 5 or 10 years run rate out of it. On the wind turbine side, We've seen it come and go. I think all the wind turbines I bought, 01, 02, and 03 were sourced out of Denmark, Germany, or the towers were made in North Dakota or Louisiana. It's a function of logistics, the steel getting sourced, the labor to form the steel and weld and then ship, and then the logistics of the trucks and trains to get it to the site. So if you're bringing it overseas, we were getting towers in 03 or 05 from Vietnam for a while. So it depends on the world market for plate steel, the cost of oil. When oil was $120 a barrel, we were getting more stuff from North America. Today, you remember that map I had up with the red dots? It's everywhere. It's now, what's the net back? What can it be delivered for? Is it rail? Is it car? Is it coming by boat? I think we bought a lot of blades one year from a company in Brazil, but that changed a year later. So it's just like any other commodity when you're buying things. It's not, I would say it's that $1 trillion invested has caused the global supply chain network in wind and solar it's pretty dispersed. And I don't think the man or woman left of center or right of center in the White House is going to change that materially. I think the horse is out of the barn, like I said earlier. The economics are there. The global supply chain is pretty sophisticated. People are going to find ways around it legally to deploy that product and buy it from wherever they are. So people are selling to us. The bigger challenge we had 5 or 10 years ago, it's kind of related to your question, is currency issues. We were deathly afraid 5 and 7 years ago, buying at the euro, sourcing stuff from a company in Germany and buying in euros and then converting to dollars. And we've seen big movements in the euro. I think at the peak we were buying at $1.60 or $1.30 equivalent. Now it's $1.07. So you see that the currency movements probably have more impact than tariffs, where we're buying from, hedging on that.
I was wondering, with the new Trump administration, do you think that investors are nervous about the renewable industry, or do they see past that and understand the improving economics?
That's a very good question. On November 8th was the election. The 9th, 10th, and 11th, everybody in this room pretty much knows what the S&P 500 is, right? There were 5 stocks that performed worse than us the 3 days after the election. 5. 4 of them were Obamacare stocks. We thought, holy heck, what just happened? I'm not talking politically. I'm talking about, Warren Buffett has a phrase, something about the stock market is a long-term weighing machine or something like that. I might be paraphrasing it wrong. We don't look at the daily price of the stock and say, oh, stop investing in wind or put double in wind next year because the stock went up or down $1 or $2. But in our stock, I think we dropped $13 a share in those 3 days. For a company that but for September 11th, but for a few of those bad days in 08 and 09 when the markets were gyrating all around, our stock doesn't generally move up a lot or down a lot due to external news. And we went down from, I think we were 126 the day before the election. I think we were 113 on Friday. We were at 132 earlier this week. Investors were asking us for 30, 60 days, what's going on? What's going to happen? You're going to lose your renewable investments. They're going to retroactively do this. They're going to prospectively do that. So there was a large effort underway to message and find out from the new Congress and the new president what's going on. It took a few months. The pendulum swung back to where it is today. I think we're at 128 or 30 today, 113 the day after the election, or a couple days after the election. I'm not trying to say that that is a measurement of everything's fine, but we've gotten assurances. There were some things that only you'd notice on C-SPAN. Secretary Munchin was being confirmed, and there were certain questions asked by certain senators in the confirmation hearings around the wind tax credits, and he gave the answers that gave comfort to investors. So part of that recovery in us and some of the other companies in our sector that are tied to renewables was more positive. And then there were little other things that happened on Capitol Hill and with the White House as the transition happened, and now we're 2 months in or 3 months in. It's less of a threat, and investors see it as less of an issue. And we've had different assurances from different elected officials that they're not out there to change things, and it's a deal is a deal, so to speak, on the phase-outs that were agreed to in a bipartisan way at late 2015. So I think today we stand in a position that's less concerned, but on November 10th, 11th, and 12th, there was a lot of concern in South Florida. Yeah. We have a different concern too, just to have a little fun. Mr. Obama would come down often to Florida for fundraising. Mr. Trump now lives a couple miles from where our headquarters is. And remember the map? So when he comes home for the weekend, every other weekend, we got bucket trucks and people worry about the lights. You just don't want to be on Twitter. So we run around making sure we're not on Twitter on the weekends when he's visiting.
How do you think the North Dakota pipeline will influence your company and renewable energy in the coming years?
I didn't hear the first half.
How do you think the North Dakota pipeline, how do you think that will influence your company and other forms of renewable energy over the coming years?
Can't think of a way it could help us or hurt us. Same way I can't think of Bristol-Myers drug. If Bristol-Myers Squibb comes out with a new drug that solves X or Y, it affects us in the sense that we're employees and citizens that might buy the drug. Direct connection to our business model, I don't see a direct connection.
In their recent outlook to 2040, ExxonMobil estimated renewables would account for only 4% of global production. Do you agree with this assessment?
What is it today?
I think it's 3% today.
They're lowballing you. I think remember we talked about the smartphone and how ubiquitous it is and everybody lives with it and boop and all that stuff. I just have a tough time believing 3-cent, 5-cent solar is not going to penetrate the Middle East, North America. Europe's pretty saturated. Europe's done. But as the grid turns over, I don't mean the grid, as the generation piece of the grid turns over, right, the stuff that gets retired and replaced for economic reasons. Coal in this country was 50% of the energy just 4 or 5 years ago. Now it's 30. Most of that is not public policy. Most of that is economic decision-making for 2 reasons. Not renewable. Renewables is the second reason. First reason, natural gas is $1 in the Marcellus or $2 or $3 at Henry Hub. That's what took a lot of coal out. Economic, why run a 50-year or 40-year-old steam turbine that's a coal plant when over here I can put through cheap natural gas through it or convert the boiler or just build a new combined cycle or simple cycle. That put more coal out of business than anybody in Congress or the White House. And then the phenomenon of renewables change it. I would argue, and this is just speculation, 70 or 80% of the coal retirements in the country are because they have a choice now that's cheaper and cheap natural gas. Had nothing to do with politics. Some of it politics, yes. Are there certain coal plants that state commissions or regulators said, no, we don't want to see that retrofit or we don't, pushed you a different way? Were those in blue states or red states? I'm sure they happened in both. But we've largely stopped worrying about that. We're largely out there figuring this is a horse that's already out of the barn. Stop worrying about the politics. But the 4% sounds low. And I'm assuming that includes hydro, wind, solar, all that kind of stuff. Sounds low. I'd be shocked by, you said 2040? Yeah. I'd be very surprised if we're not there in the 2020s.
Yeah. I think we have time for about one more.
Okay.
Hey there, can you speak to the future of nuclear power and say maybe why it's not in your strike zone?
Okay. In my spare time, my group also buys nuclear plants. I worked at a nuclear plant for a few years early in my career. I have a soft spot for nuclear power, just like I do the New York Mets. Very topical this week, if you're following the front page of the Journal. I believe, first of all, existing nuclear and new nuclear, and let me throw you a few factoids out there to give you some context. The variable cost of running a well-run nuclear plant today, just the variable cost, the cash operating cost, remember I threw a lot of numbers up there? $30-ish a megawatt hour. Just the fuel and the people and the maintenance. Not the capital recovery, not the cost to own the plant. So have that in your head. Then also take in your head what a new nuclear plant, if it's going to last 40, 50 years or longer, what that costs. That's $100 to $150 a megawatt hour in the United States. Third fact, When you're in the oil and gas business and you're Exxon, BP, Shell, Chevron, those guys, right? You're spending, if I remember correctly, a recent 10K a couple of years ago, I read a bunch of them to make this point. I think they average 15, 20, 25 billion a year per company in capital spending and exploration and production, right? Just bets in the oceans and the seas of the world and the newly developed finds they have on onshore or offshore. Those companies are $200, $300, $400 billion market caps with $10, $20 billion per year R&D budgets or capital spending budgets. So let me back up. Why am I going down that road? They make a lot of dry holes, no pun intended, right? Whether it's in the ocean or not. $1 billion mistakes, $5 billion mistakes, $10 billion mistakes. But it's in the context of a 5-year program that might be 50 or 100 billion of decisions at Exxon or BP or whoever. And then as an aggregate, as a group, they're making hundreds of billions of dollars of decisions over a 5-year period, hundreds of billions. And if they make a mistake, they know that's part of the business, right? The electric utility business in this country is 50 different countries. What Georgia does doesn't talk to Florida. What Florida does doesn't talk to Alabama. What California does not coordinate with Nevada from a policy point of view, telling what the utilities can and can't do. Now you're looking at a nuclear plant in South Carolina and Georgia that is a $10 or $15 billion decision, even before this week. The market cap of one of those utilities, I think, is 8 or 9. The market cap of the other utility that owns roughly 45 or 50% of the 2 units in Georgia was on that list I had up there. I think they're around, we're at 61, I think they're 47 billion market cap. So when they made the decision, they were probably 35 or 40. Their net piece of that is $8 to $10 billion, right? Just enterprise value. I'm not worried about equity and debt splits right now, right? Why would a company in a sector bet 50, 100, or 150% of its market cap on one business decision that might supply 5, 10, or 20% of its product to its customers? Why take that risk? Even if it was $40 a megawatt hour or $60 a megawatt hour, reasonably close to price. When it's 120 or 110 or 130 and you have other choices that are 20, 40, or 60, I'm not saying you have to buy renewable. Natural gas is on the margin, $3 times $7 is $21 a megawatt hour plus the capital to recover the plant is another 20. It's $40-ish, maybe 50 in a high cost spot. Even if gas goes back to $8, that natural gas plant is still only a $70 or $80 product, all in. Why would you ever make the decision and bet your whole company on that? So you may ask, why did they do it? Well, they made the decision in 08 and 2010 when gas was $8 an MMBTU, not 2. Fracking hadn't happened yet. They had plenty of chance to get off that off-ramp, but they chose not to. Complicated reasons why they didn't get off that treadmill. Complicated reasons. Now they have this mulligan right now called Westinghouse Toshiba filing bankruptcy. What do they do? It could be very interesting what they do because they have different choices now. It's going to be very painful to go either way. It's going to take some big dollars and some big political negotiations with their regulators and then a big customer impact and a big impact to those customers. But I would argue from how to run the railroad to use IT, I just don't see new nuclear being built in this country. And it's not politics or emissions, right? It's just economics. It's a big bet. 2/3 or 3/4 of the utilities in this country are smaller than one single nuclear investment. And there's so many other choices, whether you believe in natural gas being cheap for a long time or renewables being inexpensive. There's plenty of other ways to get to the finish line in supplying a prudent decision that's cost effective for your customer. I just think, why make a 10 or 15 year permitting, construction, and business bet that takes 10 or 15 years to deploy when you can make a natural gas bet that takes 2 to 4 years or a renewables bet that takes 1 to 3 years. And you can stay in your window of business decision making that looks more pragmatic.
So I was going to say, you think that solar, wind, and supply would be 20% of the market share? You said that earlier in the lecture?
In the next 15 years, yeah. It's at 7 or 8 right now.
Okay, I would just say maybe nuclear power has the potential if invested in to do more than 20%.
It's 20 today. Nuclear is 20% of the country's energy. But what you're forgetting is, just because it's diversity, which is important, diversity is important, when you walk into that state commission and say, I want to raise rates 25%, and if it's that expensive, you're raising everybody's rates, and elected officials like to get reelected, and everybody in this room is all for this and all for that until they find out the price. And I'll use another analogy because you guys proved my point. Nobody knew the unit price, but a couple people in the middle. Everybody knows the price of gasoline, right? $2.20. Everybody buys gasoline. They see the unit price all the time. Would you pay $12 a gallon just in Indiana? I'm assuming you're from Indiana, but if you were staying in Indiana for the next 10 or 20, would you pay $12 just because it created more jobs for people in Indiana? No, you'd drive over to Michigan, to Niles, or you'd get your gas when you're in Chicago, right? I just don't believe that we should be investing in products that are more expensive, whether it's offshore or new nuclear, just to create jobs. Or eventually you cut your throat if you're doing things just to create jobs. You got to do things that are economics that also create jobs, that can survive the marketplace pressures. And that's just maybe that's something I learned at the University of Chicago, and if I'd been an elected official, I would have got brainwashed a different way. I don't know.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mike O'Sullivan.
Thank you.
Bag.
Oh, thank you. Super.
Swag bag from the Joseph College.
Thanks.